became interested in China politically as a result of being involved in what was called the militant tendency in Britain, which was a Trotskyist group that I was involved in for my sins in the 1980s. And the specific focus that I had was on Stalinist countries, on countries in the Eastern Bloc and China, Cuba and so on. So that was my speciality from quite a young age. I eventually ended up going to East Germany and living in East Germany before the Berlin Wall came down and participated in the revolution there. And it was the study of these type of societies that became my sort of life vocation. So that's really why I've ended up still looking at China, and why I've, to a significant degree, why I've come to the conclusions I've come to, which are not mainstream, but I think will become quite mainstream in analysing some of the processes which are going on. I think there are people from different directions who are coming towards the same type of conclusions about what the character of China is and what's happening in China. But some of them, from quite vastly different political and intellectual and economic directions. So because the title of the meeting was Communism or Capitalism, which wouldn't have been the title I would have chosen, but because it was that, I'm going to refer specifically to the concepts of communism and capitalism to help clarify where China could be placed on those scales and allow people to identify what strands constitute elements of one structure, system, form of power, form of social organisation, and what elements constitute the other and how they relate to each other. And I think that combination, the concept of a combination of systems battling internally within a single state, is really the best way to grasp an understanding of what's happening. But my contention will be that the dominant forces in China today remain what I would call the forces of planning. And the forces of planning, I will argue, are elements fundamentally of socialism, and the forces of the marketplace, the forces of what Marx called the law of value, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a few minutes, are the dynamics and processes and laws of motion of the capitalist system. Marx never actually wrote much about socialism. He did very, very little about socialism. He analysed the system of capitalism in its development, transformation, and how he foresaw it ending. He analysed the laws of motion of the system of capitalism and identified it as a system driven by commodity production for profit. The commodity production for profit was organised around what he called the law of value, and the law of value was basically a theory whereby human labour power and all other commodities are, or is a commodity, better said, under capitalism, and like all other commodities, its value is determined by the average socially necessary labour time required to produce it. The law of value is a law whereby within that system of organisation, capitalism produces commodities to sell on the marketplace for a profit. And that's the driving dynamic within the capitalist system. That's what Marx basically outlined in rough. What that meant was that a spontaneous process emerges within capitalism to buy and sell commodities for a profit, including human labour power, and to organise the entire economic system, manpower and means of production and resources around those dynamics, around the dynamics of a spontaneously organising system of production for profit. That dynamic under capitalism determines its characteristics. It determines the fact that it is anarchical and spontaneous means that it is not beforehand that you know the results of what will happen. What will happen within a society cannot be foretold in advance by the capitalists as a whole, Instead of this, the capitalists will individually, for example, if they run a hotel, try to run their hotel, hoping that that people will walk through the door. They don't know if this will happen or not. They have no pre-knowledge about the dynamics of what marketplace would exist. So the system functions through periods of overproduction. There will be periods when the hotel is empty, periods when the hotel is full, periods when they could have rented out extra rooms, periods when they might break up the rooms into several parts to rent out extra rooms, other times when they can't get anybody in the rooms. And so it's the very nature of capitalism that you have periods of overproduction, periods of overcapacity, periods of unemployment, periods of growth, periods of contraction, periods of disproportions in the economy. And then there's another law which Marx dealt with in volume 3 of Capital, which is what he called the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, a long-term tendency that companies compete one against another, increase the amount of capital expenditure versus human labour power expenditure, and this results in a long-term tendency for the rate of profit to fall, which when it reaches a certain point within society results in the onset of economic crisis. And there are people who argue that this is the reason for the present economic crisis. Behind all the appearances, is underlying it is something else which they say is the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. There's the school within Marxism who argue that, which I happen to agree with. Now, the reason why I explain these theories of Marx about capitalism is because it was from analysing these theories that he drew conclusions about how an alternative social system might look. He said that rather than paying human beings what it takes to bring them back to work, you would instead get paid, this was the concept of transition, you would be paid by the amount of hours. So you receive a chit, effectively, for 8 hours work. And that 8 hours work would be a component part of the total hours of work of all the workers in society, which is different to paying you a piece of paper which says this will equal, or money will equal, the amount of labour time required to bring you back to work. In other words, the amount of beer it takes to make you happy at the end of the week to get you back to work the next week, or beer and crisps and a bit of chicken and whatever else, yeah? So that's a concept of a transition from capitalism towards a socialistic form of organising labour time. The second thing he said was that you would have, in the Communist Manifesto, for example, he put forward a number of demands. I'll cite a few of them. Centralisation of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank, state capital, and exclusive monopoly of that bank. In other words, public ownership of the banks and centralised control of credit. Again, the reason why I refer to that is because a centralised credit system, publicly owned, can enable you to plan what you do with credit and resources. If on the other side you have private banks, then the way in which they organise the allocation of credit is entirely spontaneous, connected with profit rates, returns on profit, investments and so on. And sometimes that can be speculative, sometimes that can be useful, just it's relatively arbitrary. But in any case, it's a spontaneous regulator, the law of value governing the spontaneous market processes within society. Marx also called for the centralisation of the means of communication and transportation in the hands of the state. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, bringing cultivation of wastelands, improvements in soil generally under a common plan, equal liability to work. The idea was that they would organise industrial armies to ensure that agriculture provided sufficient food for the cities during harvests and so on. The combination of agriculture with manufacturing, the gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country, free education, combination of education with industrial production. Quite simple demands they were. This was 1848, the Communist Manifesto. They were quite simple demands. Many of the other, there were 10 total demands. Many of the other demands were realised. The right to vote, at least in some countries, the right to vote,
abolition of slavery.
Pensions, and slavery wasn't actually in there because slavery in Britain had been abolished, and in Germany, where it was really orientated towards at that time, was already abolished. But it was taken as part of the course that they would be a bit against slavery. They also demanded the expropriation and nationalisation of feudal estates, the mines, and a few key resources. So the idea was that they would gradually, once you seized control of the key sectors of the economy, you would gradually extend planning outwards to the rest of the economy, but only when a sufficiently large scale was developed that would facilitate that process. Now what happened was, of course, was that, let me continue a little bit more on what specifically Marx said, sorry. He said that when they were analysing the dynamics of capitalism, one of the reasons they didn't make a blueprint as to how they thought socialism would be was because of the dynamism of capitalism constantly changing the technical level of society, which enabled them or would facilitate a different type of solution to the problem. For example, Marx was famously walking down Regent Street. It wasn't Hamley's, but it was a toy shop, and he saw this electric train in the window, and he stood there and shouted out, in front of everybody on the street there, "This is it. This is the future," like that. And he, it was for him it was a sort of revelation. Then you see in his letters, he writes to Engels and discusses how electricity can be applied to agriculture and how agriculture could be completely transformed as a consequence of that. So he was discussing the idea of the technical development of society determining the character of the new society that could come about, and therefore they didn't want to make very specific predictions without knowing when such opportunities would be available. They believe that commodity production would be replaced by planned socialist production. Labour time, as I said, will be replaced by some sort of chit or planning of labour. Bookkeeping, large-scale economy, so in other words, the larger the entities of production, the more easily they would be controllable. So if there were lots of little peasant holdings, it was obviously difficult to check what they produced, how much they produced, where they produced, what type of resources they produced, and therefore the system of accounting and control would be very, very difficult to implement. Whereas if you had a large factory, easy to do accounting and control. That's basically was the argument. So the scale of development of technology and industry was to lay the foundation for the creation of the new society. The discipline of piecework, which was created by capitalism, was he believed, actually disciplined the workers as well as the industrial process to allow people to self-discipline themselves. Once you'd acquired a certain level of technique, people would have a discipline associated with that level of technique. People become used to new forms of organisation. I mean, originally the Luddites destroyed the machines because they couldn't stand them. Obviously because they were exploitative, but also because they'd come from the countryside where you could sit around all day doing nothing, if there was good weather and good harvests. Other times you might have to work your arse off, and no matter how hard you worked, you wouldn't get anything. Whereas industry itself organised the production like modern times with Charlie Chaplin. So that type of organisation of production disciplined human beings and created modern society. So that was really what Marx was saying was the foundation basis upon which socialism would be created. And he believed that interestingly enough, there was discussion about distribution, because it's one of the areas where most people completely misunderstand the issue. Marx did not argue for egalitarian distribution. He argued, in fact, even he argued for the first phase of socialism, there would be what he called bourgeois right. In other words, you work for 8 hours, I work for 8 hours, both of you get 8 hours chit. That 8-hour chit, of course, is different. You may have children, I may have no children. So in other words, what I can do with that 8 hours is completely different. We're paying people unequal quantities. You may be a doctor, I may be a road sweeper. My compound labour, the amount of skill that's incorporated in my labour and your labour is completely different. So again, it's unequal payment. What Marx called bourgeois right would rule during the transition to a point in which production would reach such a level that you would have sufficient so that you can put crisps on the table and no one eats them. In other words, human beings can take according to, or will produce according to their ability and take according to their needs, whatever they want. That was the famous phrase The communist society would inscribe on its banner, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. So there's a very specific concept about how the technical level would have to be created for there to be a communistic future, which would pass through first a dictatorship of the proletariat. By that he meant the rule of the majority of the working classes, the new industrial classes or the urban classes, would take over the running of society. Remember at that time that most countries they didn't have the right to vote, for example, even. And then they would reorganise production, distribution and exchange to serve the needs of the general population, to shift towards a system of planning, and then as the level of technology and productivity of labour increased to such a level that there was a surplus, an abundance of wealth, that abundance of wealth would lay the foundation for the gradual dissolution of money, disappearance of money as the mechanism of whipping the people to do something. There would be no carrot. Instead of this, people would work because of their internal volition, and their collaboration would be a free association of producers and consumers. This was the theoretical framework of which Marx left behind as a vision of socialism. But that's pretty much it. What I've said is pretty much it. And if I'm talking about economics, of Marx's economics of capital, I could start a discussion here, but 5 weeks later, I would not have touched on the details of what Marx had said about economics of capitalism. But in the economics of socialism, I've pretty much covered it. I've pretty much covered what Marx said, because I'm dealing with what came out of his analysis of the system of capitalism. Now, what follows from that is that the analysis of the Soviet Union has to start from the standpoint, if you're accepting that theoretical framework, which of course all the leaders of Russia, Eastern Europe and so on in theory did, that in Russia there was no economic foundation for socialism. This simply did not exist. However, once the revolution happened, and it happened as a result of the war, Lenin and co believed that the war, and in fact the leaders of the Second International believed that war, before 1914, in 1912 they held a meeting in Bern, I believe it was Bern, where they resolved that they would call a general strike and insurrections in the event of war, and that the workers would take power and there would be the overthrow of capitalism. That was effectively their programme. But they betrayed that programme in 1914 in nearly every country, and therefore this new revolution broke out only as a consequence of the conflict of warfare which engulfed Europe. So then we arrive at the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution's basic concept, Lenin's concept, was grab the state, seize state power, establish a government, a dictatorship of the proletariat, and peasantry was the original idea, because the peasantry was the overwhelming majority in Russia, and appeal to the European workers to overthrow their governments, to end the war and establish a revolutionary government all over Europe. And then the technical and scientific level of development of Europe could be put at the disposal of Russia and facilitate the development of Russia. But there was a long discussion right from Marx's time about how Russia could develop. Vera Zasulich wrote some letters to Marx. Marx wrote 4 different replies to her, which were very... they were actually concealed. Even Vera Zasulich concealed them, because he had put forward some sort of idea that he might be able to escape the process of development by leaning upon cooperative agriculture in Russia. But this was a very unusual view from Marx's point. It does contradict basically what most of the rest of his writings said. But I just wanted to mention it because it's been pointed out to me a couple of times when I've been going through these things. So I just mentioned it as a passing issue. But the whole experience of the 20th century, and in particular the early years in the Soviet Union, indicated all the problems that would emerge in a backward country. They seized control. The original program of Lenin was seize control of the banks, seize control of the industries, but only some. And most of them they would leave in private hands. That was the idea of Lenin in 1917, 1918. But it didn't work out that way. They actually ended up seizing everything. There was a civil war broke out, and they ended up seizing absolutely everything, not only absolutely everything, but they went to the peasantry and grabbed their food as well. 1921, there was the new economic policy. This is relevant, in my opinion, because it's central to understand what's happening in China. The new economic policy was a retreat from, or they believed it was a retreat because they thought they were going to storm heaven and that Europe would come to their side. But actually what happened was there was no European revolution. There were revolutionary outbreaks, protests in France, I think 1918 to 19. In Hungary there was a revolution temporarily. In Bavaria there was a revolution temporarily. In Bulgaria there was a revolution that didn't last long. The occupation of factories in Italy. There were movements, but none of them succeeded in taking power. Germany was probably the closest, 1918 to 1923. But once 1923 was gone, that was also out the window. But in any case, the central argument, if you meet various Trotskyists, and I could sort of still call myself a Trotskyist, but in any case, that's the background I came from. They would always argue, well, if the German Revolution would have happened, then everything would have been all right. I don't agree with that. That argument, I think, is completely false. The question of development in Russia would still have been the same. It may have been helped, it may have been sped up, but it still would have been the same. How do you get 150 million people who are peasants to a level of development of technology, science, culture that would be the foundation for socialism, let alone communism? And that problem was, of course, the central problem which was posed in China in the Chinese Revolution as well. They took power in a country that was economically backward, overwhelmingly peasant society without modern industry or technology. You could argue that in the 16th century China was more developed than the West, but that's not the issue. You're always dealing with the level at which the existing society operates. So the comparative level was the decisive issue. Mao thought he could avoid that, of course, through all sorts of tricks and turns. In the 1920s in the Soviet Union, they allowed private agriculture, they allowed private industry, they allowed foreign ventures, and instead of having workers' control and management, they installed one-man management, marketplace competition between companies. This was even under Lenin, marketplace competition between companies, in order to develop the economy, the technical level of the most advanced sectors of the economy. They protected them in the sense that the large industries were protected through both a trade monopoly with the rest of the world, but also they were basically gathering resources. For example, if the banks are all nationalised and you run a little hotel, then every time you pay money into the bank, the money you've made in your hotel is going towards the state. If the state allocates those resources towards the state sector, then it's transferring resources from the private sector to the state sector. Now, the analogy that someone I'm going to rely upon for my arguments, by the name of Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, he was the main theorist of what was called the left opposition. There were three main forces in Russia in the 1920s in the discussion about industrialization. One was the right opposition, led by a man named Bukharin. The left opposition, which was really, in theory, was led by the theoretical economic arguments, were led by a man by the name of Preobrazhensky. And then Stalin came into the fray later on, but it was more of a political act, his influence, rather than having a concrete economic program. Preobrazhensky put forward the argument in a book called The New Economics, which was the fundamental document about how the dynamics of a new society would come about in conditions where you're moving from capitalism or pre-capitalism towards socialism. And what he did was he looked at Marx's arguments and he said, Marx said at the end of volume 1 of Das Kapital, that the way in which capital acquired its wealth originally was something which he called primitive capitalist accumulation. Primitive capitalist accumulation meant seizing the land from the peasants in England, driving them off the land, forcing them to come to the cities, enslaving people in Africa, transporting them to America, getting extra wealth as a consequence of that, imperial exchanges, going, for example, with a manufactured glass to Latin America, meeting the Incas, and in exchange for a manufactured glass, receiving a big pile of gold. In other words, thousands of hours of work were exchanged for half an hour's work. An unequal exchange was the foundation for enormous amount of present-day capital. In fact, last week there was an interesting article, I think it was The Independent, where they said that many of the most famous people in Britain required their original capital, or much of their original capital, from the slave trade. Yeah. So primitive capitalist accumulation, the accumulation from pre-capitalist forms, from feudalism, from peasant production, from pre-capitalist economic systems elsewhere, created enormous foundation of wealth upon which the capitalists could acquire. But also, the other element was, capitalism could outcompete feudal production internally. So you only had to have one capitalist factory within an environment of petty production, producing shoes by hand, for example, in order to outcompete the competitors. Socialist production doesn't start like that. It doesn't start by having better cooperation between people. I mean, some people did argue that, Proudhon and so on did argue that, but in actual fact, that the theory was, in any case from Preobrazhensky and co., was that socialism begins by seizing control, ownership of the means of production, creating a unified entity which can then, as a state and as economic entities, compete against capitalistic competition, or better said, produce more effectively according to some planned system. So, for example, if you bring together the banks, the mines, the steel industry, rubber production, then you can plan to produce tractors, which the marketplace may or may not produce, because they may not have it as a priority, and therefore bringing those resources together is a precondition for planning the use of those things. So here you have that contradiction again, the law of value and planning. That clash of forces is the essential foundation for laying the basis for what would be called socialistic production. And I use socialistic rather than socialist, because it's laying the foundation to outstrip or outcompete the capacities of capitalism within your country. But then in theory, of course, the objective would be to do that on a world scale, to be able to outcompete the capitalists' productive system on a world scale. Now, I hope you can see where I'm going with this. The Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, what they did was, in 1929 to 31, they nationalized everything. They did it for political reasons. There was political internal conflict inside the Soviet Union. That internal conflict meant that an attack was made against Preobrazhensky and the advocates of rapid industrialization on the basis of exploiting pre-capitalist productive systems. Stalin argued, along with Bukharin, you can move to socialism very slowly by enriching the peasantry. And once the peasantry are rich enough, they'll demand goods, and that demand, spontaneously developing from the marketplace, would enable the accumulation of enough capital to facilitate the creation of large-scale industry by the state. Preobrazhensky and the others, the left opposition, they argued, you instead have to extract from the peasantry more than you give the peasantry. In other words, you will have to exploit them. You will have to exploit the peasantry, but you must also remember they were previously exploited by the landlords. The landlords have been abolished. So they otherwise would not be contributing anything unless they were taxed or the pricing system was oriented against them, or to the objective of accumulating sufficient capital to provide for the cities for food, but also to provide resources to industrialize. The hope was that if you rapidly industrialize, you can provide the peasants with seeds, with technical tractors and modern machinery, resources, which will encourage them to participate within that marketplace, to freely exchange their goods. The idea was you can be exploited, but that doesn't mean your living standards go down. You could be exploited by a rapid development of industry which provides certain goods towards the peasantry to facilitate their growth. The problem was at that very specific moment in the late 1920s, what happened was Russia reached the level, economically, industrially, that it had when the revolution happened, or better said, before the First World War happened. It utilized the technology that it already had, exploited it to the maximum, and then there was a need for new capital, for new investment, that would have required long-term investment without returns. You couldn't give, if you needed to build large-scale industrial factories, the resources were not there to build them and simultaneously raise living standards. You had to have lower living standards or relatively no increase in living standards at the same time as acquiring resources for industrialization, for creating factories that would only bring returns in 10 or 5 years' time or longer. So this was the fundamental problem which confronted the Soviet Union. It was resolved by a political campaign, because what happened was the peasants turned around and said, well, we're not giving you anything. You know, there's a little story about this. The communists would go to the countryside, and he would go to the countryside. We generally send the workers there as propagandists, communist workers. They would go to the countryside. They call a village meeting, and they say, "Comrade, are you prepared to give your sheep for the revolution?" Translator said, "Yeah, you can have all my sheep." He says, "Great, comrade." He says, "Are you prepared to give your cows for the revolution?" He says, Yes, comrade, you can have all my cows." He says, "Are you prepared to give your pigs for the revolution?" He says, "You're not having them." He says, "Why not? You're prepared to give your cows, your sheep. What's the matter with your pigs?" He goes, I've only got pigs." That's right. So they just slaughtered the animals. The consequence was Stalin declared class on class, and a war was fought against the peasantry. The resources were seized, everyone was forced into collectives, agriculture collapsed. But the resolution was made. I mean, they had acquired the resources. Could they have acquired those resources, the capital resources necessary for development, by a more gradual approach to development in agriculture, or better said, in relation to dealing with the peasantry? That's a moot point and a question that you can't really answer. But if you look at what happened in China after 1978, they began to denationalise, or better said, they allowed the peasants incentive to operate in agriculture. They also allowed foreign capital to invest and private capitalists to develop. They created joint ventures. They permitted capitalistic elements to enter into the economy. Now, many people declared that this was, in fact, the Gang of Four declared Deng Xiaoping as a counter-revolutionary who's re-established capitalism. He's had a coup d'etat in 1978 and re-established capitalism. Whereas actually the state sector of the economy grew until 1992. There were 118 million workers in the state sector. Before 1992, you couldn't leave the countryside. You were forced to stay exactly where you were. Even to this day, these rules still exist, but they're not applied. A massive migration took place from the countryside to the cities. In the last 15 or so years, 300 million people have moved to the cities in China. That's more than the entire adult population of Europe. It's about the same as the whole population of the United States of America. It's the biggest migration in human history. But it has taken place at a time of the most rapid advance or rapid alleviation of poverty, reduction in the lowest level of poverty of any country in human history. The rate of economic growth between 1979 and today is the most rapid rate of growth of any major economy in the history of the world. It's more than 9% a year on average throughout that period. And relatively smooth development, unlike the development when everything was nationalised. Once you had everything nationalised, what they called the planned economy, what actually happened was you can't plan if everything's nationalised, because if you say there are 1 billion people we must provide shoes for, it allows no leeway within that system. You have to have a surplus of goods to be able to ensure that actual real demands are met. Instead of producing all size 8 shoes, for example, you can't know those type of things by centralised planning alone, unless you have such a sophisticated level, what was called by Hayek and all these sort of people, sort of almost like a universal brain, or an incredible computing system. So price, as the Hayek brigade or the conservative theorists in the 1920s argued, has a role to play in order to control and check the supply and production of goods. So the law of value can act as a check upon planning. And really, what's happened is in China, they focused on key sectors, what they say, let go of the small, seize the large. Let me give you an example of what let go of the small means. The guy wrote to me a couple of days ago, he reminded me of it, who I met in Shanghai a couple of years ago. And I met him on the street and he started talking to me. And I said, "What do you do?" He says, "Oh, I've got a shop." I said, "What's the shop?" He says, "That." I said, "What's that?" And it's a table this big with cigarettes on it. He says, I said, "Who do you work for?" He says, "For the government." He's working for the government selling cigarettes like that. And he's been working like that for 30 years, selling cigarettes. That's, that is part of what used to be, I mean, he's still working at, I think, the planned sector of the economy. Whereas actually, Cigarette production, perfectly logical that that should be owned by the state. It is owned by the state in China. But every single outlet for selling cigarettes to be run by state employees, and he wasn't paid according to the amount of cigarettes he sold. He was paid a wage for sitting there and selling the cigarettes. So he didn't care if anybody bought them or not, you know. And that contradiction between large-scale production, which is plannable, and small-scale production or small-scale activities which are not plannable is the fundamental contradiction that has come to a head, if you like, or attempted to be resolved in China over the last 30 years. How long have we gone on? I'll do maybe,
we've got
10, 15
9:30.
Right, okay. The system that exists today, in particular since 2001, it was believed most people on the left came to the conclusion 2001 was the transition point. China entered the World Trade Organization, it participated in the world market, it allowed capitalists to enter the Communist Party. The Communist Party started talking about market economy as a dominant factor. They talked about socialist market economy instead of a socialist economy. They got rid of what was called the iron rice bowl. Well, I used to work in China at the time when the iron rice bowl still existed. So in other words, from cradle to the grave inside the factory you were provided for. It was like a welfare state, factory-based welfare state. So each workplace in the urban areas would be publicly owned and would have creche facilities, schools, hospitals, dentistry, cinema, theatre, all inside one factory. And it was available only to the people inside the factory and their families. You had a job for life. Not only did you have a job for life, that was introduced in the 90s, not only did you have a job for life, but your children would inherit your job. I think some places in Europe, some little things like that exist, but this was a universal phenomena in the state-owned sector in China until the mid-late 1990s. 1990s, the bureaucracy in China flushed out these sectors, essentially put them on what they called market principles, but actually they don't really function on market principles at all. They look like capitalist companies, they appear to be capitalist companies, they're called market-based companies, officially they function for profit, but actually all the principles which exist in the Western organisation don't really apply. Unless you stretch it to incorporate the sort of some things that have happened recently in the West. In the credit system, 75% of all bank loans go to the state. They don't go to private companies at all. It's almost impossible for private companies to get bank loans. Private companies go on the illegal market and have their own secret bank lending systems. But if you borrow in that, if you enter a black market for lending, the penalty is the death penalty. So it's quite severe. It's not, that Wonga might be an idea with Wonga to do that. But anyway, there was a case recently, a woman called Little Sister, and she was in Wenzhou. Wenzhou is the most freewheeling city in China. Lots of small little companies, all connected with the production of things like buttons, for example. Wenzhou produces nearly all the buttons in the world. They produce nearly all those lighters that you light up and stop working after 3 times. They're all produced in Wenzhou. Things like that type of production. Small-scale little family units producing for private companies. Wenzhou is the centre of Chinese capitalism, if you like. But Little Sister ran into some difficulties in the financial crisis. She had borrowed money from various sources, and then she couldn't pay them back, and then she was put on trial, and she was sentenced to death, but then they commuted it to something like life imprisonment or something like that.
Oh, nice.
In the 1980s, there was quite a thriving market in the countryside, legal market in the countryside for access to money. So lots of private or semi-private entities emerged, what were called township village enterprises. They were officially cooperatives elected by the local community, but actually many of them were run by a couple of families who really seized effective ownership of them. But after 1989, after Tiananmen Square, that was clamped down on, and private finance in the countryside was almost completely eliminated, and larger townships, the level above the village, became really in control of the resources in the area. There are three elements to this. One is many of the bureaucrats, there's a huge bureaucratic apparatus controls the society. The bureaucratic apparatus is similar in its organisational structure to what exists in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe and so on. You have the Communist Party, its organs, the trade unions, the women's organisation, the youth organisation, then its representative Congress, National People's Congress, local People's Congress, Workers' Congress inside the workplaces, which are supposed to have control over the workplaces but actually don't. So these types and then local government, structures of local government. These effectively control the apparatus of power. The government will move, the economic dynamics are determined by what's something called the National Reform and Development Commission. National Reform and Development Commission came out of the planning ministries in the 1980s, which were all old Stalinist planning ministries. What they do is they draw up a calculation of what can be done with the resources of local government, national government, and publicly owned enterprises and banks. They then draw up, in conjunction with the Central Committee, a plan as to how society is supposed to develop, how many new jobs there will be, how many people will be, how many schools there will be built, how many universities will be built, how rapidly the society will grow, how much agriculture production in general will be, the overall vision about how to develop. And they have long-term plans, 5-year plan, 10-year plan, 50-year plan. And all these plans are quite detailed, scientific, reasonably scientific plans. If you look back at the plans from 1980, you'll see they surpassed all the plans, but they're actually very similar. What happened is very similar to what they forecast would happen. That fundamentally, in my view, reveals that China is not driven by the law of value, which spontaneously regulates an economy such that you cannot forecast what will happen in the future within that society. That's the fundamental proposition I'm making. I think the other thing that you can use as the gauge of that is what has happened since 2008. 2008, when the world financial crisis hit, almost every single economist in the world predicted that China would collapse. Any time China's on the edge of collapse. Why is it on the edge of collapse? Because China is exporting to the world, it's interdependent with the world economy, its wealth and growth has been based upon that, and therefore it will inevitably collapse. That was the argument that was given. There were a couple of different elements within that argument which were flawed. One was China's exports are far smaller than what people had said. Roughly only 10% of GDP, rather than 45 or 60% some people have been saying. Because they import goods, assemble them, export them again. So the actual added value is not much. The Chinese really do that for know-how accumulation. The other thing was they thought that that there had been a huge privatization program. In the 1990s, around 60 million people were made unemployed from the state-owned industries. But actually, and then there were shareholding companies created in their place of many of these companies, and these shareholding companies have done quite well. The actual truth of the matter is that these shareholding companies are not private companies at all. They're actually owned by the state. The 70% of all the shares on the Chinese stock market are state-owned companies. They basically, what happens is there are now about 115 central state-owned companies. They own the shares in companies that have been turned into limited liability companies. These or better said, they own, let's say, 51%, 55%, 70% of the shares. Other entities, including foreign companies and so on, are allowed to buy minority stakes in the companies, but they're never allowed to gain control of these companies. This enables them not only to hold one company, but through these companies, generally Chinese large companies, the largest 116 or so, which is the central government control, all controlled by the Central Committee. The people who run these companies have a position of ranking within the bureaucracy as high as a Central Committee member, as high as a leading government official. And these companies, they own a myriad of companies in that same way. they'll own, some of them, they will own only 30% or 25%, but it will be a controlling share. And therefore, the overwhelming majority of all urban Chinese economy is publicly owned. In fact, anybody been to Shanghai? Shanghai is sort of shown as the freewheeling, dealing city. There was a study done by a right-wing economist recently, 2008, a man by the name of Ya Shenghuang. Ya Shenghuang made a detailed study of the records of the People's Bank of China. No one had ever done that before. 11,000 documents of the People's Bank of China. And that revealed the interconnection between the way in which the state controls the whole allocation of resources within the economy. Actually, China is overwhelming. He reckoned about 50% or 50% of the economy is publicly owned. In agriculture, in the area where you would think it would be most free, or better said, sorry, in Shanghai, he said Shanghai is 80% publicly owned, except for the fact that they allow foreign companies in. But foreign companies come with their money, but they gain zero political power. Consequence of that is that actually foreign companies are favoured over indigenous companies. Chinese national bourgeois, internal Chinese capitalists, have enormous difficulties. I met a guy a couple of years ago. He runs a company selling things to Sainsbury's, actually, like home base, some big tools, equipment, sort of brooms, ladders, things like that. And they've got about 1,000 workers in this company. But he was just one tirade after another about how the government mistreats his company. They try their best to try to make some profit. The government comes, says, give us this much money. We want this much money for a school, this much money for whatever. It could be corrupt stuff, but it can also be stuff that's necessary for maintaining the regime in power, if you like. Now, what I'm going to argue as a final point is this. Why is this system in power? I believe that actually what it's revealed is that the economics of socialism, I'm not saying China is socialist, I'm saying the economics of socialism, in other words, public ownership of the commanding heights of the economy and banks, of the decisive levers of economic power, is more efficient because of its ability to mobilize resources for the total national benefit of society than capitalism is. And I think that's been revealed by what's happened over the last 30 years in China. And if you look at the program of the pro-capitalist faction within China, the theorists and the economists, their program is for a much reduced rate of growth, is what the World Bank program a couple of years ago, for example, encapsulates their type of demands. A much reduced rate of growth, concentration on light industry, concentration on small private companies, privatize the large industries, and allow the law of value to take control. In other words, allow the little private companies to gradually become bigger, take control of key assets in society, and then they believe that would be a more stable society. Stability is actually the other important element here. The class relations, Marx argued that the working class would be the liberator of society, so that the bigger and bigger the working class would become, the more they would be capable of taking over the running of society. Obviously, the perfect test case for that now is China. Here you have the biggest working class in the whole of human history. And it's my contention that the reason why the Communist Party has maintained its official allegiance to socialism is precisely because it fears the working class. The primary concentration of the government is how do we maintain social stability? And social stability means urban stability primarily. How do they maintain urban stability? And that is, they must utilize whatever resources they get to make sure that they can pacify the rising demands of the working classes. A couple of examples of how that's manifested itself in the new 5-year plan. Since last year, 2011, the new 5-year plan proposed a massive extension of social programs for the general population and extension of infrastructure. For example, one single example would suffice to give you an idea of the scale of what's happening. Everybody knows that people have been buying and selling houses in China in recent years, and that's become, everyone said it was like England or like France, or, which is all true. On the other side, who's the beneficiary of that? Well, there are a couple of levels. One is local government, national government, township government and village government. These are the entities selling the land or selling access to the land. So they acquire resources to invest in infrastructure. So it's not like here where the land is privately owned. It's acquired by the state to invest in the state. or to steal. Obviously, some people are bureaucrats are stealing as well. So that's the dynamic. On the other side, in 2011, a program was introduced in the new 5-year plan to build 36 million public sector apartments for rent at low cost, council flats basically, who rent at low cost to the general population. That's the biggest housing program of any country, even on percentage basis, in the whole of human history. It's like it's 40% more housing stock than the whole of Britain to be built in 5 years, to be built actually in 3 years from now actually, for public sector low cost rental. So you get an idea of that, and even in the scale of China, that's huge. I mean, you're dealing with around 80 million people will be housed in these houses, which is again a constituency. It's building a base of constituency of support for the state as well. Anyway, I've spoken for a long time. I've spoken about quite a few subjects, and I'm sure it's enough for you to delve into.
Thank you.